Story 1. The chill of January 16, 1998, in Florence clung to me like a shroud woven from damp stone and forgotten secrets. It was a cold that bit deeper than mere temperature, a pervasive dampness that seemed to seep into the very marrow of my bones, whispering of antiquity and untold histories. I had arrived in this city, a pilgrim of art and introspection, seeking solace and inspiration in its Renaissance grandeur. But the Florence I found that night was not the sun-drenched postcard vision. It was a labyrinth of shadows and silence, a canvas painted in hues of gray and encroaching night. My rented apartment, tucked away on a narrow, cobbled side street near the Arno, was a relic in itself. High ceilings, peeling frescoes depicting faded cherubs, and windows that rattled with every gust of wind against their ancient frames. It felt less like a temporary dwelling and more like a temporary occupant in a space that had witnessed centuries unfold. The air inside, even with the unreliable heating struggling to make an impact, carried the faint, musty scent of aged paper and dried wood. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant, muffled clatter of a passing moped or the melancholic chime of a campanile bell, announcing the slow march of a timeless night. I had spent the day wandering, camera in hand, trying to capture the elusive essence of the city. Yet, by dusk, a strange unease had settled over me. The usual vibrancy of the streets had dwindled, replaced by an unusual emptiness. Fewer tourists, fewer locals hurrying home. The city seemed to hold its breath, anticipating something I could not yet name. As twilight deepened into full night, the streetlights cast long, distorted figures that danced with the wind, transforming familiar alleys into pathways of suggestion and doubt. Back in the apartment, the quiet pressed in. I lit a few candles, their flickering flames casting dancing shadows that swallowed the corners of the room, making the familiar walls seem to shift and breathe. The ornate furniture, dark and heavy, took on monolithic forms in the dim light. I tried to focus on a book, but my eyes kept darting to the windows, to the unyielding blackness beyond the glass. It wasn't merely darkness, it felt like a presence, a watchful, patient observer. A soft, almost imperceptible scratching began. It seemed to come from the wall directly opposite me, the one shared with the neighboring building. It was rhythmic, persistent, like the slow, deliberate scrape of fingernails on old plaster. I held my breath, straining to listen. It stopped. Then, just as my nerves began to settle, it resumed, a little louder this time, a little closer. I told myself it was mice, or the settling of the ancient building, but a knot of apprehension tightened in my stomach. The silence that followed felt heavy, pregnant with unspoken things. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful. Dreams were a kaleidoscope of shifting angles, of narrow corridors that twisted back on themselves, of unseen eyes watching from the periphery. I awoke with a start. The room plunged into absolute darkness, the candles having long since guttered. The scratching was gone, replaced by something far worse, the distinct impression of someone standing just outside my bedroom door, utterly motionless, utterly silent. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I strained my ears, but there was nothing, no breath, no rustle of fabric, no creak of the floorboards. Only that overwhelming sense of presence. I pulled the heavy wool blanket higher, burying my face, waiting for dawn, for the promise of light to dispel the unseen. The next morning, the city felt different. The light was weak, diffused by a low, gray sky, but it was light nonetheless. I ventured out, needing to shake off the lingering dread. The usual crowds were still absent, an unusual quiet persisting. As I walked, I began to notice them. Not individuals, but indistinct shapes at the very edge of my vision. A figure turning a corner just as I approached, too swiftly. A shadowy form disappearing into an alcove as I glanced up. They were always just out of focus, always on the periphery, like dust motes in the corner of one's eye. It was in the Piazza della Signoria, amidst the looming statues, that the unease solidified into something more tangible. I was standing near the Fountain of Neptune, admiring its weathered grandeur, when a subtle movement caught my eye. Across the vast piazza, near the Loggia dei Lanzi, a small gathering of people stood. At first, they seemed ordinary, a group of bundled figures braving the cold. But then I noticed their stillness. They weren't conversing, weren't moving, weren't even observing the monumental art around them. They simply stood, facing vaguely in my direction. My gaze lingered, and a chill independent of the January air prickled my skin. They wore heavy coats, hats, scarves, their bodies obscured by layers of dark fabric. But it was what I couldn't see that froze me. Where faces should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless expanse, a void beneath the brims of their hats, or within the shadows cast by their scarves. It was not a trick of light or distance, it was an absence. A clean, terrifying blankness. My breath hitched. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again. They were still there, those faceless forms, still utterly still. A sudden, irrational panic flared. I wanted to run, to scream, but my feet felt rooted to the cold stone. I forced myself to walk, slowly at first, then picking up pace, my eyes fixed on the pavement, until I was hurrying, almost running, away from the piazza, away from those silent, watchful figures. The incident in the piazza marked a shift. The city, once an inviting historical tapestry, now felt like a stage, and I, the unwitting performer. Everywhere I went, the sensation of being observed intensified. I saw them in the reflections of shop windows, distorted and fleeting, their featureless forms blending with the blurred cityscape. I glimpsed them down side streets, standing in doorways, always still, always watching. They were never close enough to confirm, never distinct enough to point out, but the cumulative effect was crushing. I tried to rationalize it. Jet lag. The isolation of solo travel. An overactive imagination fueled by old Gothic architecture. But the logic faltered against the relentless, visceral dread. My appetite vanished. Sleep became a battle against the unseen. I started barricading my bedroom door at night with a chair, a futile gesture against something so pervasive. One evening, unable to bear the confines of the apartment, I ventured out for a late-night walk along the Arno. The river flowed dark and silent, reflecting the scattered lights of the city like shattered pearls. The air was heavy, damp, almost palpable. I walked towards the Ponte Vecchio, its ancient shops like forgotten teeth in the mouth of the bridge. The usual romantic charm was replaced by a profound sense of desolation. As I neared the bridge, I saw them. Several of them, standing on the Ponte Santa Trinita, further downriver. Their forms were silhouetted against the faint glow of the opposite bank, unmistakable. They were facing me, perfectly still. My blood ran cold. There was no way they could have moved there so quickly from the piazza. They were always already there, waiting. My breath hitched in my throat. I turned, intending to retrace my steps, but as I did, another group appeared from the shadows beneath the bridge I was approaching. They emerged slowly, silently, their dark shapes appearing from the darkness with an unnatural grace. They didn't move towards me, but spread out, forming a loose, curved line, effectively blocking my path back towards the apartment. I was caught between them. The Ponte Vecchio behind me, the new group ahead, and the other group on the distant bridge. My mind screamed for a way out. I looked to the river, black and swirling below, an impossible escape. The air grew colder, the silence heavier, punctuated only by the distant lapping of the water against the riverbanks. My eyes darted between the two groups. The ones closest to me began to shift. Not walking, but gliding, their movements eerily smooth, as if on unseen rollers. They didn't hurry, didn't make a sound, but the distance between us was undeniably shrinking. The complete lack of any discernible features on their faces was the most horrifying aspect. It wasn't grotesque, it was an emptiness that suggested a profound, unnatural blankness, a mirror reflecting nothing. A primal fear seized me. Every instinct screamed to flee. I looked desperately around, my gaze falling on a narrow, unlit alleyway to my right, just before the entrance to the Ponte Vecchio. Without thinking, I bolted, plunging into the inky blackness. The alley was a suffocating tunnel of damp stone, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. My footsteps echoed loudly, a frantic drumming against the oppressive silence. I scraped my hand against a rough wall, but I didn't stop. I could feel their presence behind me, a silent, accelerating pursuit. I didn't dare look back. The alley twisted and turned, seeming to stretch on endlessly. Just as I thought I would collapse from sheer terror and exertion, I saw a faint light ahead. A street, hopefully a main thoroughfare. I burst out, gasping for air, into a brightly lit intersection. Taxis idled, a few pedestrians hurried by, and the normalcy was a sudden, jarring shock. I spun around, my eyes scanning the mouth of the alley I had just exited. It was empty. No shadowy figures, no blank forms. Nothing but the inky blackness of the alley mouth. My mind reeled. Had it been a hallucination? A stress-induced nightmare? But the raw terror still clung to me, a cold sweat dampening my clothes, my heart still thudding violently. My hand throbbed where I had scraped it, a tangible reminder that what I had experienced had been real. I stumbled into the nearest taxi, uttering the address of my apartment in a shaky voice. The driver, oblivious, nodded and pulled away. As we drove, I kept my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those faceless shapes materialize in the reflection, gliding silently through the Florentine night. Back in the apartment, I packed quickly, my movements jerky and uncoordinated. The idea of spending another moment in this city, in this silent, watchful place, was unbearable. The train station. That was my only thought. I didn't care where the next train was going, as long as it was away from Florence. As I closed the heavy wooden door of the apartment for the last time, the old building creaked, a soft, sighing sound that seemed to follow me down the narrow stairs. I hurried through the deserted street, my small suitcase bumping against my leg. The street lights cast their long, lonely shadows. And then, I saw it. In the faint light spilling from a shop window across the street, a solitary figure stood motionless in a darkened doorway. Tall, slender, cloaked in deep shadow. It was facing me. And in the fleeting glimpse I allowed myself, I could discern the same unnerving blankness where a face should have been. I didn't stop. I didn't scream. I just kept walking, faster now, my eyes fixed straight ahead, until the figure was behind me, until the street turned, until the only sound was the frantic pounding of my own feet on the cold cobblestones. I made it to the station, purchased a ticket to the first available destination, and sat shivering on the platform, surrounded by the few other nocturnal travelers. As the train pulled away from Florence, carrying me into the anonymity of the Italian night, I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, looking back. The city lights twinkled, distant and innocent. But I knew better. I knew what lurked in its shadows, what watched from its ancient corners, patiently waiting. The journey was a blur of fear and exhaustion. Days later, back in the familiar confines of my own home, the Florentine cold still seemed to linger in my bones. I avoided windows after dark. Every unexpected sound sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. The memory of those blank, empty faces was etched into my mind, a chilling reminder of the unknown terrors that can lie hidden beneath the most beautiful facades. Florence, the city of art and light, had become, for me, the city of the faceless, a place where the shadows held more than just darkness, but an unsettling, silent void that still, to this day, watches from the periphery of my waking nightmares. Story 2. The wind was a living thing on the Orkney Islands, a relentless, icy breath that seemed to scour the very bones of the land. It was January 18, 1998, a date that would forever etch itself into the marrow of my memory. I had arrived weeks earlier, a solitary figure dispatched by some obscure historical society to catalogue the forgotten archives of the old Stromness lighthouse, a sentinel of grey stone against an unforgiving, churning sea. My predecessors, I was told, had merely skimmed the surface, leaving behind boxes and crates untouched for decades, a treasure trove of maritime history. Or so I believed. From the moment the small ferry churned away, leaving me stranded on the rocky outcrop, a profound sense of isolation descended. The lighthouse was a stoic, cylindrical giant, its upper lamp housing a cyclopean eye that swept the darkness in rhythmic, hypnotic pulses. Below, the keeper's quarters were a series of stone-floored, low-ceilinged rooms, perpetually damp and smelling of salt, aged timber, and something else, a faint, persistent tang I couldn't quite place, like old metal or forgotten dreams. My initial days were a blur of unpacking, arranging my meager belongings, and setting up my work area. The silence was the first thing that truly settled in, a heavy, oppressive blanket. It was not merely an absence of sound, but an active, resonant quiet, broken only by the perpetual roar of the Atlantic battering the cliffs and the shriek of the wind through every crack and crevice. At night, the sweep of the lamp casts dark, fleeting shadows across the bare walls, making the empty rooms seem to shift and breathe. I found myself frequently turning, expecting to see something, anything, only to be met by the cold, unwavering stone. The archive itself was in a small, windowless room, thick with the dust of forgotten years. Stacked haphazardly were ledgers, logbooks, navigational charts, and, to my particular interest, a collection of old audio reels and cassette tapes. Most were clearly labeled, weather reports, radio communications, perhaps even personal messages from previous keepers to their loved ones on the mainland. I began with the easiest, the neatly organized documents, deferring the more cumbersome task of audio cataloging. The winter tightened its grip. Snow, driven by the gale, began to paint the windows white. The ferry became a distant memory, communication with the mainland limited to a crackling, often dead shortwave radio. I was utterly alone, adrift in a sea of time and stone. The solitude, initially a welcome balm for my usually hectic life, began to fray at the edges of my composure. Each creak of the ancient building, each whistle of the wind down the spiral staircase, became amplified, distorted by the encroaching loneliness. One particularly fierce afternoon, as a blizzard raged outside, rattling the very foundations of the lighthouse, I stumbled upon a small, unmarked wooden box tucked away behind a stack of mildewed charts. It was heavy, surprisingly so, and when I pried open the rusted latch, I found it filled with a single, unassuming cassette tape. It was old, its plastic casing discolored with age, the label peeled off completely. There was no indication of its contents, no date, no owner. Just an old, blank cassette. A strange compulsion seized me. Ignoring the neatly labeled tapes that awaited my attention, I reached for my portable cassette player, a trusty, if dated, piece of equipment I'd brought specifically for this task. My fingers hesitated over the play button. A whisper of unease, a flicker of apprehension, like a chill draft through the room. It felt different, somehow, from the other tapes. Too quiet, too anonymous. But the curiosity, amplified by the suffocating boredom of isolation, won out. I pressed play. For a long moment, there was only hiss and static, the familiar white noise of an old, unloved recording. I adjusted the volume, straining my ears. Then, faintly, subtly, a sound began to emerge from the cacophony. It wasn't human speech, nor was it the expected crackle of a radio broadcast. It was a low, undulating drone, like a distant, distorted wail, or perhaps the mournful cry of a forgotten foghorn. It pulsed, rising and falling with an unnatural rhythm. Beneath it, something else, a faint, repetitive click, not unlike the slow, deliberate turning of a heavy mechanism. I frowned. Perhaps it was just the sea, captured by a faulty microphone, or the mechanical workings of the lighthouse lamp itself, somehow magnified. The equipment was old, after all. I dismissed it, telling myself the storm outside was playing tricks on my ears, distorting sounds. I turned off the player, the unsettling drone replaced by the more familiar howl of the wind. The next few days brought no respite from the weather, only a deepening sense of dread that coiled slowly, imperceptibly, within me. The sounds of the lighthouse began to change. What I had previously attributed to the wind or the old structure now seemed deliberate. A faint scraping sound from the floor above, a soft thud in the empty lamp room. I told myself it was settling foundations, the acoustics of the circular tower playing tricks. Yet, I found myself pausing mid-step, holding my breath, straining to hear beyond the gale. The shadows cast by my lantern at night seemed deeper, longer, prone to sudden, fleeting movements just at the edge of my vision. I'd whip my head around, my heart thudding, only to find the walls stark and empty. Paranoia, I reasoned, was a natural byproduct of such profound solitude. The unmarked tape lay on my desk, a dark, silent presence. It called to me. The memory of that strange, mournful drone lingered, a persistent echo in the back of my mind. The storm showed no signs of abating. Days bled into one another, marked only by the repetitive sweep of the lamp and the dwindling of my non-perishable supplies. Desperation for any distraction, any deviation from the crushing monotony, outweighed the lingering unease. I picked up the tape again, my fingers cold against its aged plastic. My breath plumed in the frigid air of the small room. I inserted it into the player, my hand trembling slightly as I pressed play. The static returned, a familiar curtain. But this time, it seemed thinner, less opaque. The drone was clearer, a low, guttural lament that resonated not just in my ears, but in my chest. And beneath it, distinctly, a new sound emerged. A soft, wet shuffling, like something dragging itself across rough stone. It was slow, deliberate, punctuated by what sounded uncannily like heavy, ragged breathing. My heart gave a jolt. This was no malfunction. This was no wind. The click, too, was clearer now, a rhythmic, metallic clink, 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 slow and steady. It sounded like chains, perhaps, or something being pulled. I yanked the headphones off, my breath catching in my throat. The sounds had been so vivid, so disturbingly real. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. An old recording of a storm, a shipwreck? No, the breathing, it was too close, too organic. I felt a prickle of goosebumps crawl up my arms. I forced myself to put the headphones back on, though my hand shook. The sounds continued, the dragging, the heavy breathing, the clink. They seemed to move, subtly, as if recorded from different points within a large, enclosed space. An echoey, cavernous space. Like, I thought with a sudden lurch of terror, the inside of a lighthouse. My own lighthouse. I snatched the headphones off again, my eyes darting around the small room. The familiar walls, the shelves of books, the lamp hanging above. Everything seemed normal, yet imbued with a new, sinister weight. I was hearing something impossible. A recording of what? A historical incident? But the quality was too raw, too immediate for something from the distant past. And the breathing, it felt alive. Sleep became a fractured thing, haunted by the memory of the tape's unsettling audio. Every shadow held menace, every creak promised a revelation. I started leaving a small lantern lit in the main living area, its flickering glow a small comfort against the encroaching darkness. My work stalled. I spent my days pacing, checking locks, peering out through the ice-streaked windows at the ceaseless gray expanse of the sea. The isolation, once merely a condition, had become a cage. The phenomena around the lighthouse escalated. A book, left carefully on a table, would be found face down on the floor. A drawer, previously shut tight, would be ajar. The old radio, left in its static hum, would sometimes emit a brief, garbled burst of sound, not human voices, but something guttural and indistinct, before falling silent again. I would stand frozen, listening, my ears aching, but nothing more would come. One morning, I found a single, small, circular pebble, smooth and unnaturally cold, resting precisely in the center of my bed. I hadn't brought it in. The doors and windows had been locked all night. I stared at it for a long time, my mind grasping for a logical explanation that simply wasn't there. The fear solidified, no longer a nebulous anxiety but a sharp, cold spike in my gut. I knew, with a horrifying certainty, that I was not alone. Something else was here, within these stone walls, moving in the shadows, making its presence known. And the tape was the key. Days later, driven by a desperate need to understand, a need that warred constantly with a primal urge to flee, I returned to the cassette player. The blizzard was at its peak, the lighthouse a tiny, trembling beacon in a world of white fury. The very air inside seemed to vibrate with the force of the wind. I loaded the tape, my hands now steady with a grim resolve. I pressed play. There was no static this time. The sounds began immediately, sharper, clearer, as if the tape itself had evolved, shed its layers of obfuscation. The low drone was now a distinct, guttural moan, a sound of immense suffering or immense hunger. The wet shuffling was horrifyingly vivid, the sound of something heavy and soft dragging itself across wet stone, interspersed with the distinct squish of something viscous. The metallic clink, clink, clink was undeniably the sound of heavy chains, dragging, bumping against hard surfaces. I snatched the headphones off again, my eyes darting around the small room. The familiar walls, the shelves of books, the lamp hanging above. Everything seemed normal, yet imbued with a new, sinister weight. I was hearing something impossible. A recording of what? A historical incident? But the quality was too raw, too immediate for something from the distant past. And the breathing, it felt alive. Sleep became a fractured thing, haunted by the memory of the tape's unsettling audio. Every shadow held menace, every creak promised a revelation. I started leaving a small lantern lit in the main living area, its flickering glow a small comfort against the encroaching darkness. My work stalled. I spent my days pacing, checking locks, peering out through the ice-streaked windows at the ceaseless gray expanse of the sea. The isolation, once merely a condition, had become a cage. The phenomena around the lighthouse escalated. A book, left carefully on a table, would be found face down on the floor. A drawer, previously shut tight, would be ajar. The old radio, left in its static hum, would sometimes emit a brief, garbled burst of sound, not human voices, but something guttural and indistinct, before falling silent again. I would stand frozen, listening, my ears aching, but nothing more would come. One morning, I found a single, small, circular pebble, smooth and unnaturally cold, resting precisely in the center of my bed. I hadn't brought it in. The doors and windows had been locked all night. I stared at it for a long time, my mind grasping for a logical explanation that simply wasn't there. The fear solidified, no longer a nebulous anxiety but a sharp, cold spike in my gut. I knew, with a horrifying certainty, that I was not alone. Something else was here, within these stone walls, moving in the shadows, making its presence known. And the tape was the key. Days later, driven by a desperate need to understand, a need that warred constantly with a primal urge to flee, I returned to the cassette player. The blizzard was at its peak, the lighthouse a tiny, trembling beacon in a world of white fury. The very air inside seemed to vibrate with the force of the wind. I loaded the tape, my hands now steady with a grim resolve. I pressed play. There was no static this time. The sounds began immediately, sharper, clearer, as if the tape itself had evolved, shed its layers of obfuscation. The low drone was now a distinct, guttural moan, a sound of immense suffering or immense hunger. The wet shuffling was horrifyingly vivid, the sound of something heavy and soft dragging itself across wet stone, interspersed with the distinct squish of something viscous. The metallic clink, clink, clink was undeniably the sound of heavy chains, dragging, bumping against hard surfaces. And then, a new sound. A low, raspy whisper, just at the edge of audibility. It was not words, not human language, but a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone, or sand blowing across a forgotten tune. It was close, chillingly close. My eyes snapped open, a scream catching in my throat. The sounds, they weren't just coming from the headphones. They were in the room. Faintly, beneath the roar of the storm, I could hear the distinct, wet squish of something moving from the corridor outside my study door. The rhythmic clink of chains seemed to echo from the spiral staircase, rising slowly. And that whisper, it seemed to coil in the air directly behind me. I tore the headphones off, the silence that followed even more terrifying than the sounds. My breath hitched. The air was colder, suddenly, shockingly so, right behind me. A wave of nausea washed over me. I slowly, agonizingly slowly, turned. The corner of the room was empty. The shelves were just shelves, the walls just walls. But the chilling cold remained, a pocket of unnatural frost in the damp air. My gaze fell back to the tape player, still playing, its tiny red light glowing steadily. The sounds from the tape seemed to emanate directly from it, yet simultaneously from the very fabric of the lighthouse around me. A horrifying realization bloomed in my mind, a tendril of ice spreading through my veins. This wasn't a recording of the past. It wasn't a historical document. The sounds on the tape were happening now. They were happening here. Or worse, they were anticipating what was happening. The tape wasn't a record, it was a conduit. It was a terrifying, sonic mirror reflecting the creeping terror that had invaded my solitary sanctuary. A loud, wet thump from the room above. The library. The sound was immediately, sickeningly, reproduced on the tape, followed by the dragging shuffle. My blood ran cold. The sounds on the tape were not merely a historical echo, they were a living, breathing, horrifying soundtrack to my present nightmare. I scrambled back from the desk, knocking my chair over with a clatter that sounded deafening in the suddenly amplified silence of the room. My eyes darted around, searching for an escape, for a weapon, for anything. The lighthouse, once a comforting symbol of safety, had become a tomb. The clink, clink, clink of chains grew louder, closer, echoing from the base of the spiral staircase. The shuffling, squishing sound was now right outside my door, a sickening, unhurried progression. I could almost feel the vibrations through the stone floor. That whisper, too, was omnipresent, a dry, malevolent rustle that seemed to caress my ears, speaking directly to my deepest fears. My gaze fell on the thick, steel door that led to the outside. My only way out. But the storm raged, a blinding, lethal wall of snow and wind. And what if it was out there, too? What if this thing, whatever it was, had come in with the storm? The door to my study slowly, agonizingly, creaked open. Just a fraction of an inch, but enough to show the inky blackness beyond, a darkness deeper than the storm outside. From that crack, the whispering grew louder, a chorus of dry, rasping sounds that seemed to coalesce into an impossible, formless word. I was trapped. The lighthouse, my refuge, was now my prison. The tape player, still glowing red, still playing, was the only witness, the only proof of the impossible horror unfolding around me. The sounds from the tape surged, overwhelming my senses, the groan, the shuffle, the chains, the whispers, all now deafeningly loud, filling the small room, reverberating in my bones. They were no longer distinct sounds but a terrifying, cacophonous symphony of impending doom. My hand, as if guided by some desperate, last-ditch impulse, reached out, finding the eject button on the cassette player. My finger hovered, trembling, over the plastic. The sounds, both from the tape and from the growing presence in the doorway, merged into one unbearable, suffocating roar. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing myself, and pressed the button. A final, soft click. The sounds vanished. The tape ejected, sliding silently from the player. Silence. Not the familiar, oppressive silence of the lighthouse, nor the roar of the storm. A new silence. A profound, absolute stillness. Then, from the darkness of the doorway, a new sound began. Not a wail, not a shuffle, not a clink, but a slow, deliberate intake of breath. Deep, lung-filling. The sound of something alive and very, very close.